over the long term. You would take a spending rule percentage year after year, but that over the long term, you don't dig so deeply into the endowment that you erode the principle of that endowment. A quasi-endowment is what most parishes have, and this is what is also known as a board-restricted or a vestry-restricted endowment, where you would have funds that you didn't need, or an unrestricted bequest would come to you. And the power of the vestry is to, let's put together an endowment fund where we will treat it as if it were a true endowment, only spending a percentage of the total value over time. Now, what is the difference with that type of an endowment? A true endowment, you cannot invade the principle over the long term. With a quasi-endowment, one that was created by the power of the vestry or the power of a governing board of an institution, a future vestry does have the power to invade the principle. Now, this is an epidemic problem, quite honestly, back east, where there are many, many parishes that are digging deeper and deeper and deeper into their quasi-endowments, making exceptions every year. The point I wanted to bring up about this, though, is what do you think that does to the sense of trust and confidence among the members of the congregation? It erodes it, right? Why would someone want to give you an additional planned gift if all you do every year is just dig deeper and deeper into your unrestricted quasi-endowment? That was the main point I wanted to make here. There are many other types of funds that people hold which are not endowments. Sometimes they call them endowments. Reserve funds are a clear example where you're holding funds to replace a boiler, to build a rectory, to do something like that. Over time, some reserve funds can actually become quasi-endowment funds. We work with a number of parishes that were planning on building a rectory at one time and then chose not to. And so they used those reserve funds to actually create a quasi-endowment. Sometimes people talk about something that's held as a trust as an endowment. It really isn't. This was very popular in the 40s and 50s, where typically a wealthy individual would leave a trust, FBO, for the benefit of a parish. And what would happen is that a trust company or a bank would pay out a certain value, a certain income to the parish for years and years to come. It's not truly an endowment, though, because the parish has typically zero control, zero input on how those are invested. I was a treasurer in a parish in Manhattan, and we had a similar thing where we had a trust. A woman had died again, an elderly woman that no one knew she had any money. She left $100,000 to St. Ignatius of Antioch back in 1960 with a 5% amount that was supposed to be given out every year. Do you know how much we still got in 1990 when I was treasurer? $5,000. Because at that time they had complete control over what got distributed. So that is not an endowment. An endowment is one where you, typically the parish, have control over and decide how it's invested. We're going to skip through some of the slides just to keep on target, and also so that you all have more time to ask some questions. But I've mentioned now a couple of times some documentation that the Episcopal Church Foundation is happy to make available to any parish throughout the country. And if you still have your sheet on your table, if you immediately would like an electronic copy of these best practice policies, all that you need to do is put a big E next to your name, and I'm happy to share them, and I'll just pass around a few copies while I have them. And all I want to do today, really, though, is just mention a few factors about them and why they're important. They're important because of what I had said before. What you're seeking over the long term is to build trust and confidence among the members of your congregation. As you read through these documents, or as you do in the future, parts of them are crucially important. They're all important. Some are even more important. The enabling resolution ends up being one of the most important because what it does, it sets the standards for how you're going to be investing that endowment, how it's going to be used. Are you going to create a separate committee to monitor the endowment? What are all of those aspects? And we encourage you to pass all of these as vestry resolutions so that the leadership of the congregation is intimately involved in making all of these decisions, and because your parish may have some quirks. I know very few Episcopal parishes have quirks, but maybe yours does, and you may wish to incorporate some of those particularities within your endowment structure. But there are a number of other policies that are useful, again, to build trust among your congregation. Having clear investment guidelines is always advisable so that you have standards for how you will compare the performance of your endowment over time. Disposition of bequests. This is a very important policy. What it refers to is that it tells you how you're going to treat bequests that you receive, whether it goes through a process of a committee or of your vestry, whatever the case might be. I would strongly, as I said before, encourage you to consider putting every planned gift in an endowment, because an endowment, if properly used, is being used for the future mission and ministry of your congregation and truly would serve the desires of people making a planned gift. But can anyone come up with some ideas for when it might be appropriate for your parish or for another, when you would use a planned gift for not putting it in the endowment for a particular purpose? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry, I was answering the wrong question. Go to somebody else.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have both an endowment fund and we have a reserve fund.
Mm-hmm.
And we have reserve fund allows us to tap into capital needs as we require it.
Oh, okay.
Which we wouldn't have, we'd run into all sorts of issues if it was just an endowment in terms of needing to take out more than we would legally be able to take out.
So can you think about a circumstance where someone would give you a significant planned gift and you may choose not to put it in your endowment? What would be some of those?
This is how these were established.
Oh, so that did come and it was held for that purpose.
Absolutely.
Exactly. That's actually what I was. Any other ideas? Yes, Kathleen.
To launch a new ministry, particularly if it's something that the donor had a heart for.
That would be a very good idea. Yes.
Build a new church hall or something.
Potentially. What's something that might unite all three of these together with facilities, with the vision for the future, a future ministry, and something like that? All of it is focusing on the future and things which will strategically help the health and vitality of your congregation for the future. So all of these examples are good opportunities. The one thing I will just mention as you consider doing something like that, do it as transparently as possible and do it in a way where it is very clear that you are making a decision that this is focused on the future mission and ministry of your congregation. Because you don't want to disinspire anyone from giving you a planned gift if they really intended it, just to be held in endowment. They can always say that, obviously, but it is healthier if you have this interaction and people can have that experience. Yes,
well, if you put it all into endowment, don't you run into the 7% rule? So how does that really,
depends on the donor.
You use a lot of flexibility that way. My understanding is endowment is essentially governed by a whole set of rules that require you to not ever remove more than 7% of the 3-year average.
Yeah, depending. Maybe a 3-year rolling average or something of that nature, right?
So if you're suddenly needing, a whole lot more than that to do some capital improvement that basically is economically advantageous for you to make that investment, you get more than 7% or more than you're making in that investment stream. Why would you want to tie yourself up as putting it into an endowment? question.
Well, no, it's a good question, and you may want to have both. You may want to have a capital reserve fund. However, and I'm going to pull Terry into a comment on this, there may actually be a much more advantageous means of having a capital campaign to serve that purpose.
If you have an immediate capital need, you want to process that with the congregation, because it's an opportunity to bump up your involvement, your annual giving, and leave your endowment for the purposes that you developed it. We're getting into sort of
Yeah.
so many if-then kinds of things. Let's take this as an offline thing. But typically, capital needs in a congregation are either met through what other nonprofits call facilities or a sinking fund. You're putting aside a certain amount every year in anticipation of a capital project, or you hold an out-and-out capital campaign to do that.
And it's also the donor's wishes. You may be inspiring donors to give to something that is going to last in perpetuity. And some donors really don't want something that can be accessed over time. Yes.
Isn't it generally a bad idea to use endowment funds for capital projects anyway? You just wouldn't use them. I know in our endowment, we're prohibited from using our endowment for capital projects.
And it's for the reasons that Terry just said, that you typically want to do a capital drive, use a capital reserve fund, a sinking fund, to fund that. Also, if it's a true endowment, you literally, legally cannot access those funds for that purpose. Yes, sir.
You asked about possible uses for
Sure.
a bequest. How would you view using the bequest to pay off a mortgage?
That's an interesting question. The question, I would put it out there that what is the desire of the congregation? I would try to do it in an open forum discussion, especially if you received almost the entire gift that could cover the mortgage. That may be something that really would inspire the congregation, that if you were able to pay that off, it could be a very advantageous thing. However, we may also want to consider, as Terry had mentioned before, doing a capital campaign to pay off that debt because of the other benefits of inspiring people through a capital drive. So there's no perfect answer to it. It has a lot to do with the desires of the congregation and the perceived impact it would have if you went ahead and did that. There was actually, I remember, a capital campaign where people were encouraged to make planned gifts to pay off the mortgage, and that can be very inspirational, depending. So that may be something. So a couple of quick notes, and then we're going to go back into planned giving. Designated gift policy, and this directly relates into planned giving. A designated gift policy is where you are seeking to avoid having multiple tiny endowments or multiple tiny restricted funds. There are hundreds and hundreds of candle endowments and memorial funds all across the country, and they all have to be tracked separately in what's known as sub-accounting, because once a parish accepts a restricted gift, they can only use that gift for its purpose. And if they receive an endowment, a tiny endowment, they also have to track that and never evade the principal over time. If you put into place a designated gift policy, you set a threshold where it's high enough so that if someone's going to make a restricted gift, they have to give a significant amount so that it is worth doing that special sub-accounting for. So that is something to remember as a very useful tool.
What ballpark figure would you use for something like that?
Depends on where you live. In this part of the country, probably $100,000. But it would depend on your culture and there's no one single rule. That's something we can help you think through. Spending rules are very important because you are putting in place a percentage that you'll be taking out of the 3-year rolling average or 5-year rolling average, depending on what you choose, so that over the long term, you're not digging deeply into the principal value of the endowment. Gift acceptance policies, very briefly, these can be your best friend. And and I want to hear from the lawyers actually in the room and to back me up on this, but quite often it's when you are offered real estate as a gift that it is much easier to say no to a gift that is not going to benefit the parish if you have in place gift acceptance policies that are written.
Like gas stations.
That is my, don't I always say that? Terry's heard me say it a gazillion times now. But gas stations are the prime example because you need to, if someone were to offer you this wonderful gift of a gas station, you're going to say, well, thank you, Mrs. Jones, so much for this wonderful opportunity, but for us to accept the gift, you will have to pay for the evaluation of the property, the removal of the tanks, the environmental impact study, et cetera, because what your goal is you don't want to encumber the parish so that you help the donor make a good gift, not what isn't really a gift, something that will cost the parish more to get rid of than they'll receive in exchange for that gift. So gift acceptance policies can be very, very helpful in guiding donors, but also in guiding the leadership of your congregation. Just to do a quick summary of this, I mean, it's important for you to get external advice when it comes to endowments. You shouldn't be having someone in your congregation making the calls on what bonds to buy and what stocks to buy. You should be using objective professional outsiders. There's obviously a number of options with that. You can use a local bank or brokerage house. You can use your diocesan investment trust. And of course, the Episcopal Church Foundation is always happy to help you with investing your funds. And you'll hear more details about this in the months to come, but you can actually invest alongside your diocese. And that is something that others at the foundation and in the diocese will be talking about more in the months to come to help you get the most cost-advantaged means of investing your endowment. Yes, sir?
We have I'm on the board of trustees, as is Gary. We have the San Diego Episcopal Foundation that's in place, and it's now working with the Episcopal Church Foundation, and we so we will have a wonderful asset management is here through the Episcopal Church Foundation. So everything's now in place. All you have to do is
we're all
talk.
very excited.
We're all ready to go. So just talk to us.
More to come on that, though. I think we may do a special webinar, and I'll be out here again, as Ken will be as well in the future. When you're investing your endowment, wise to be diversely investing like a prudent investor. Always measure your performance against benchmarks. Watch out for the service and fees that you're paying, that it is a reasonable amount. And I can say, and I think the foundation certainly can, ECF's service and fees are very reasonable and good. Reporting is one thing with relation to planned giving I want to say. Many of you who have sat through an annual meeting may have suffered through a very dull and boring treasurer's report with spreadsheets up on the screen showing how the endowment is doing. And that's a wonderful thing, and you have to do that because you have to be accountable. What I want to plant in your minds for the future, and you can share this with the folks who work in finance at your congregations, think about how can you tell stories that will inspire people about the endowment. Can you talk about how your endowment is making a difference in the lives of the people in your congregation, in the lives of people in your community or beyond? This is what matters more and more to people. And I know Terry talked about this in her earlier session. I presume you did. I wasn't there. I was there for part of it. About the change in demographics, that as you get to younger and younger donors, you need to see the impact, the difference that giving is making. And that's very true about endowment spending.
No, we didn't talk about that.
Oh, you didn't? I'm sure you did.
The whole workshop.
All right. So I'm just going to touch on the different types of planned gifts, because obviously, I think is it 93 in here or 94? But it's rather warm, so I don't want to belabor into the details of the different types of planned gifts, but I want to just touch on a few. I want to draw your attention that in your packets you also have a cheat sheet. Where is it? It's not coming to. And I'm not seeing it. Aha! Okay, it looks like this. It's like behind the plan giving card. What you can do, if this next few minutes is utterly sleep-inducing to you, because we're going to talk a little technical detail, if it's utterly sleep-inducing to you, you can take this recap of all the different types of planned gifts, keep it by your bedside at night, next to your daily office book, or whatever you do to spiritually help you lull into sleep at night. And you can go through all of these different types of gifts, because subliminally you'll be educated about planned giving through that means. So that's my suggestion to you. We'll talk in a moment about the quest. We'll talk about life income gifts. But just briefly, I wanted to mention a few of the other types, all of which are things that you, as leaders of your congregation, can begin to raise awareness of. One of them is what's known as tax-deferred accounts. Many of you obviously know what these are. It's where you're putting monies away into a tax-deferred account out of pre-tax income, and it builds up over time. And God willing, the markets cooperate, and actually the assets grow, so that when you retire, you begin taking withdrawals. And it's after you're taking withdrawals that you're paying income tax. Well, something a lot of people don't give much thought to is who will receive the remaining balance after you would pass away. If you leave it to a person, and eventually, I mean, you could certainly have your spouse continue to receive it. That's certainly possible. But eventually it will need to be left to someone. Often when you leave it to a person, it can be very, very heavily taxed when it's taken as a lump sum. However, if you leave the remaining balance of your tax-deferred account to a charity, such as your parish or the diocese or Camp Stevens, whatever it might be, that charity receives the gift in total without paying any of the deferred taxes. So it can be a very wonderful gift that you could make. Life insurance is also potentially a wonderful gift. It can be used in a very complex way. I won't get into the complexity. But almost any life insurance policy, whether whole life or term, could have your parish as a beneficiary, either in part or in full. That's perfectly acceptable. That's actually a good way to get people who may be younger and may not have as many obligations, that they could actually begin thinking about planned giving by designating a part of an insurance policy they may receive at work to your parish. Real estate, we actually already talked about. It can be a wonderful gift, but is often difficult. One real estate planned gift is what's known as a retained life estate, where someone literally turns over, more or less, the deed of the property to a charity, now receives a very substantial tax deduction, and then they retain the right to live in it for the rest of their lives. Can you imagine what often happens, though, in those situations? Quite often someone will retain the right to live in it. By the time they pass away, the house may be in very bad shape. And so if ever your parish is offered a retained life estate opportunity, I strongly urge that you write up a letter of agreement with that individual so that they understand they are responsible for the taxes, the upkeep costs, and everything else that's required to keep the property in decent shape, so that when you do receive it, you don't receive this dilapidated property that will cost more to get rid of than you'll receive as a gift. So that's an important factor. Bequests. There are many different types of bequests. Now, in California, I always have to be careful, and I was talking to Carrie about this before, because of course in California, not everyone does have wills, but they do typically have trusts, which they'll create. They'll do some trust planning or will planning. And it's obviously crucially important. Why? Because you get to make sure that your wishes are fulfilled. that if you do not do any of that planning, you may not have your wishes fulfilled in the way that you had desired. You may wish to give to charity, you may wish to give to certain other institutions or to different individuals. And you also need to determine, obviously, who will take care of your children and other dependents. So all of these factors are crucial in estate planning. When you're talking about making allocations for your will or for your trust, obviously there are some specific types. One would be a specific dollar amount. That's how most Episcopal institutions actually encourage people to make a planned gift. However, let me just say, it has two problems with it. One is it doesn't take into account inflation, so that a $10,000 gift today will not be worth $10,000 in the future. In addition, those specific dollar bequests must be paid out first before any other allocations of your estate can be made. So if you had a drastic turn of events later in life, it could actually upset what you were trying to do. I had a great aunt who was very charitable, not wealthy, but had a decent-sized estate, and her intention was to leave a number of bequests to a number of charities in Michigan that she supported. Well, excuse me. Well, she didn't anticipate that late in life, basically all of her assets, including her home, would need to be liquidated. Well, and so what happened is that when she passed away, she had never changed her will, and so she had 25 specific dollar bequests in her will, and those all had to be paid before anything was given to her 4 children, my second cousins. Do you know how much was left for them? After that happened, it was less than a quarter of the total that was given to those charities. And as far as my cousins were concerned, all of those charities would never receive a penny from them because they stole their small inheritance away. So just do bear that in mind. What can be more beneficial, especially because you don't know whether your estate exactly how much it will be when you pass away, would be to use percentages. So that regardless if it's a small or a large estate, you can still demonstrate that sense of passion and conviction. You could also allocate specific assets and then leave the remainder to charity. For secular charities, this is what most secular charities really want, quite honestly, because it is often one of the largest gifts that's ever given. However, it can be given intentionally and unintentionally. Intentionally, if you really had planned that you want the bulk of your estate to go, but unintentionally, if you didn't take into account all of the values of your different assets, if you forgot about certain valuable assets in your estate, or didn't account for it in your planning, you could actually leave much more than you had intended. Contingency would be that you are just planning if someone were to pass away, for instance, before you, that the asset, the amount, the percentage would then pass to a charity or to another individual. And that's just good planning. And let me just say this, I strongly urge everyone to seek appropriate legal, tax, and financial advice when you are planning your estate. And take the time to spend the money that you need to make sure that your wishes are fulfilled.